The morning of December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday at Pearl Harbor. Seaman First Class James Rasmussen wiped the sleep from his eyes as he stepped onto the deck of the USS Arizona, the salty Hawaiian breeze carrying the familiar scent of diesel fuel and ocean spray. The massive battleship sat majestically in Battleship Row, her steel hull gleaming in the early morning sun that painted the harbor in shades of gold and amber. Commander Logan Ramsey was reviewing routine reports in his office at Ford Island when he noticed something peculiar in the distance, dark specks approaching from the north. Too organized to be a flock of birds, too early to be scheduled maneuvers. The tranquil Sunday morning atmosphere at America's Pacific Fleet headquarters betrayed no hint of the catastrophe that would soon unfold, forever altering the course of world history. Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge aboard the destroyer USS Ward had already encountered the first signs of trouble earlier that morning. At approximately 6:45, his crew had spotted and attacked what appeared to be a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. The Ward's depth charges had found their mark, but the significance of this encounter would only become clear in the devastating hours that followed. On the airfields surrounding Pearl Harbor, rows of American aircraft sat neatly ranged, wingtip to wingtip, a peacetime formation that prioritized easy maintenance and security against sabotage over combat readiness. At Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Kaneohe Naval Air Station, American pilots and ground crews were beginning their leisurely Sunday routines, completely unaware that hundreds of Japanese aircraft were already approaching their position. The Japanese strike force, under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned approximately 200 miles north of Oahu. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the first wave of 183 aircraft, including K torpedo bombers, Valdiv bombers, and Zero fighters. As they approached their target, Fukuda could see the American fleet spread out below them like toys in a bathtub, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. According to historical records from the National Archives, the Japanese had been planning this attack for months, with meticulous attention paid to every detail of the operation. At 7:55 in the morning, the first Japanese bombs began falling on Ford Island. The surprise was complete and devastating. Explosions erupted across the harbor as torpedo bombers skimmed just 50 feet above the water, their deadly payloads aimed at the heart of America's Pacific Fleet. The sound of aircraft engines and exploding ordnance shattered the peaceful Sunday morning, replacing it with the chaos and terror of war. Seaman Rasmussen watched in stunned disbelief as a Kate bomber released its torpedo directly toward the Arizona. Time seemed to slow as the weapon cut through the water, its wake visible as it approached the battleship's hull. Around the harbor, similar scenes of destruction were unfolding as the Japanese attack caught the American forces completely off guard. The age of American isolationism was ending in fire and smoke, though few realized it. In those first terrifying minutes, the sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken was about to experience the most shocking military defeat in its history, setting the stage for a global conflict that would reshape the world forever. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda's voice crackled over the radio at exactly 7:55. Tora, 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 the code phrase confirming that complete surprise had been achieved. The first wave of Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor like a swarm of deadly hornets, their engines screaming as they dove toward their unsuspecting targets. The USS Arizona bore the brunt of the initial assault. Seaman Rasmussen had barely processed what he was seeing when the first bomb struck the forward magazines. The explosion that followed was unlike anything witnessed in naval warfare, a massive fireball that rose nearly 1,000 feet into the air, consuming the battleship's forward section in an instant. The blast was so powerful that it lifted men off their feet on ships hundreds of yards away. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the Arizona's damage control officer, found himself thrown against a bulkhead as the ship's ammunition stores detonated. Through the smoke and flames, he could see bodies scattered across the deck, some moving, others ominously still. The proud battleship, which had served the Navy faithfully since 1916, was now a burning tomb for over 1,000 sailors and Marines. At Ford Island's Naval Air Station, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was among the first to comprehend the magnitude of the attack. As Japanese fighters strafed the airfield, he managed to send out the message that would alert the world: Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill. The words would echo through history as America's introduction to the Second World War. The torpedo bombers proved devastatingly effective against Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma, struck by multiple torpedoes on her port side, began listing heavily. Seaman Stephen Young found himself trapped below decks as the battleship slowly rolled over, water rushing through the gaping holes in her hull. The ship that had once been the pride of the fleet was now becoming a steel coffin for 415 men. Across the harbor at Hickam Field, the scene was equally chaotic. Japanese fighters swept down in coordinated attacks, their machine guns chattering as they destroyed American aircraft before they could get airborne. Technical Sergeant William Schick watched helplessly as row after row of B-18 bombers erupted in flames, their fuel tanks igniting in spectacular explosions that sent thick black smoke billowing across the airfield. Historical documentation from the Pearl Harbor National Memorial indicates that the Japanese achieved tactical surprise due to a combination of factors, including communication failures and the peacetime mindset of American forces. Captain Mervyn Benyon of the USS West Virginia displayed extraordinary courage as his ship came under attack. Despite being mortally wounded by shrapnel from an exploding bomb, he remained at his post, directing damage control efforts until his strength failed. His dedication exemplified the heroism that would emerge from the chaos and destruction of that infamous morning. The harbor itself became a maze of burning oil, debris, and desperate men struggling to survive. Seaman First Class Doris Miller, an African-American cook aboard the West Virginia, helped carry wounded sailors to safety before manning an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use due to the racial segregation policies of the time. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African-American heroes of World War II. Japanese dive bombers screamed down from above, their bombs finding targets throughout the harbor. The USS Nevada, attempting to get underway during the attack, became a priority target as Japanese pilots sought to sink her in the harbor channel, potentially blocking the entire port. The battleship's crew fought valiantly to beach their vessel, rather than allow her to become an obstacle to future operations. As the first wave of attackers completed their runs and began returning to their carriers, Pearl Harbor lay shrouded in smoke and flames. The surprise attack had exceeded even the most optimistic Japanese expectations. But the day's carnage was far from over. A second wave was already approaching, and the defenders were beginning to organize their response to this unprecedented assault on American soil. As the smoke from the first wave began to clear, revealing the devastating scope of the Japanese assault, individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, consisting of 170 planes under Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, approached Pearl Harbor at approximately 8:54, finding American forces now alert and fighting back with desperate determination. Seaman First Class Doris Miller had never imagined he would become one of the war's first heroes. Aboard the burning USS West Virginia, the ship's cook from Waco, Texas, had already helped carry his mortally wounded captain to safety when he spotted an unmanned .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun. Despite having no formal training on the weapon, due to Navy regulations that restricted African Americans to mess duties, Miller took control of the gun and began firing at the attacking Japanese planes. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, though not present at Pearl Harbor, would later embody the spirit of American determination that was born on this day. The resolve that would carry American forces through the dark days ahead was already manifesting in the actions of men like Chief Petty Officer John Finn at Kaneohe Naval Air Station, who continued manning his machine gun despite being wounded multiple times by strafing Japanese fighters. The USS Nevada's attempted escape became a symbol of American defiance. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the ship's navigator, helped guide the massive battleship away from her berth despite heavy damage from the first attack. As the Nevada moved toward the harbor entrance, Japanese pilots concentrated their efforts on sinking her in the narrow channel, which would have trapped the entire Pacific Fleet, according to the official Navy Department communique released on December 8, 1941. The attack resulted in significant damage to the Pacific Fleet, but failed to destroy America's will to fight. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, watched the destruction from his headquarters window, a spent bullet having shattered the glass beside him. The career naval officer who had dedicated his life to preparing America's defenses realized that his peacetime strategies had proven inadequate against this unprecedented sneak attack. The weight of command during America's greatest naval disaster would haunt him for the rest of his life. At Wheeler Field, Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach their P-40 Warhawk fighters and get airborne during the attack. Flying through clouds of smoke and anti-aircraft fire from both American and Japanese guns, they engaged the enemy aircraft in aerial combat, shooting down several Japanese planes and providing a glimpse of the fighting spirit that would eventually carry America to victory. The medical personnel at Pearl Harbor demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire. Chief Pharmacist Mate John Hardin aboard the USS Nevada continued treating wounded sailors even as Japanese bombs exploded around the ship's medical stations. Navy nurses at the Tripler General Hospital worked tirelessly to treat the hundreds of casualties streaming in from the harbor, many suffering from severe burns and wounds unlike anything they had encountered in peacetime. Service Ensign Joseph Tausig aboard the USS Nevada lost his leg to shrapnel, but refused medical attention until his men were cared for first. His determination to continue fighting despite his wounds exemplified the spirit that would transform Pearl Harbor from a devastating defeat into a rallying cry for American resistance. The civilian population of Honolulu also rose to the occasion. Despite confusion about whether a full-scale invasion was underway, doctors, nurses, and volunteers rushed to help the military medical personnel treat the wounded. The attack had not only struck the military installations, but had awakened the entire American civilian population to the reality of global warfare. As the second wave of Japanese attackers completed their mission and began their return journey to the carrier fleet, they left behind a transformed Pearl Harbor. The surprise attack had inflicted terrible damage, but it had also forged something new in the American character determination to fight back that would ultimately prove far more valuable than the ships and planes that lay in ruins across Oahu. By 10 o'clock on the morning of December 7th, the last Japanese aircraft had disappeared over the horizon, leaving Pearl Harbor shrouded in thick black smoke and the acrid smell of burning oil. The silence that followed the roar of engines and explosions seemed almost unnatural after 2 hours of intensive combat. Across the harbor, rescue operations began immediately as sailors and civilians alike rushed to save their trapped comrades. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the deck of his flagship, surveying the devastation that had befallen his command. The USS Arizona continued to burn, her superstructure twisted and broken, serving as a tomb for over 1,000 American servicemen. The USS Oklahoma had completely capsized, her hull visible above the water like the back of a great whale. The sight of America's once mighty Pacific Fleet crippled in its home port was almost too devastating to comprehend. Captain Homer Wallen, the fleet maintenance officer, was already beginning to assess what could be salvaged from the wreckage. His trained eye surveyed each damaged vessel, calculating which ships might be raised and repaired. The USS Nevada, though heavily damaged, had been successfully beached rather than sunk in the harbor channel. The USS Pennsylvania, protected somewhat by being in dry dock, had sustained damage but remained operational. The human cost was becoming apparent as rescue teams worked frantically to free trapped sailors from overturned ships. On the USS Oklahoma, tapping sounds from within the hull indicated that men were still alive in air pockets. Shipyard workers and Navy personnel worked around the clock with cutting torches, and pneumatic drills, knowing that time was running out for their trapped shipmates. The Pearl Harbor History Associates documented that 32 sailors were eventually rescued from the Oklahoma, though the last survivor wasn't freed until December 9th, nearly 48 hours after the attack. Lieutenant Ruth Erickson, one of the Navy nurses at Pearl Harbor's hospital, had never experienced anything like the stream of casualties that began arriving within minutes of the attack's end. Burns victims, men with terrible shrapnel wounds, and others suffering from shock filled every available space in the medical facilities. The peacetime hospital was rapidly converted into a wartime trauma center as medical personnel worked without rest to save lives. Communications with Washington had been partially restored, and the magnitude of the disaster was becoming clear to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his advisors. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox immediately began preparing for a congressional inquiry, while military leaders struggled to understand how such a massive intelligence failure had occurred. The civilian population of Honolulu found themselves in a state of confusion and fear. Rumors of Japanese paratroopers and invasion forces spread rapidly through the community. Governor Joseph Poindexter declared martial law across the Hawaiian Islands, placing the civilian population under military control for the duration of the emergency. General Walter Short, commander of Hawaiian Department, coordinated with Admiral Kimmel to establish defensive positions around the island. Both commanders knew that if the Japanese returned with invasion forces, Pearl Harbor's damaged fleet would be unable to repel them. Every available soldier, sailor, and civilian was organized into defensive units in preparation for what many believed would be an inevitable follow-up attack. The intelligence community began the painful process of examining how such a massive military operation had gone undetected. Communication intercepts that should have provided warning had been misinterpreted or delayed. Radar contacts showing the approaching Japanese formations had been dismissed. As American aircraft returning from routine missions, fuel oil from the damaged ships created an environmental disaster across the harbor. The thick black substance coated everything it touched, making rescue operations even more hazardous. Cleanup crews worked alongside rescue teams, knowing that the contamination posed both immediate and long-term threats to the harbor's ecosystem. As evening fell on December 7th, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Over 2,000 American servicemen had been killed, with more than 1,000 wounded. 18 ships had been sunk or heavily damaged, including 8 battleships. Nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed, most while still on the ground. Yet, even in the midst of this catastrophe, signs of American resilience were emerging. Repair crews were already beginning work on damaged vessels. Medical personnel continued their tireless efforts to save lives, and military commanders were developing plans to rebuild the Pacific Fleet stronger than before. 3,000 miles away in Washington, the news of Pearl Harbor's destruction arrived like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was enjoying a quiet Sunday afternoon in the Oval Office when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox burst in with the first fragmentary reports from Hawaii. The president's face grew grave as he absorbed the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the American Pacific Fleet. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, was having lunch with the president when the call came through from Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations. The initial reports were confused and contradictory. Some spoke of a massive air raid. Others suggested a full-scale invasion was underway. What became clear immediately was that America had suffered its greatest military disaster since the Civil War. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was scheduled to meet with Japanese ambassadors Kichisaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu at precisely the moment when bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor. The two diplomats arrived at the State Department carrying what they claimed was Japan's final diplomatic proposal, unaware that their nation's military forces were already executing a carefully planned sneak attack. Contemporary White House records, as documented by the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, show that the president's first reaction was one of controlled anger rather than surprise, suggesting that some form of Japanese aggression had been anticipated, though not at Pearl Harbor. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, was enjoying a peaceful Sunday morning horseback ride when urgent messages began reaching him. Through military channels, racing back to the War Department, Marshall found a building in chaos as officers struggled to understand the scope of the attack and coordinate an appropriate response. The peacetime military bureaucracy was wholly unprepared for managing a crisis of this magnitude. Roosevelt immediately convened his war cabinet, bringing together the military and civilian leadership who would guide America through the coming global conflict. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, though not entirely surprised by Japanese aggression, was shocked by the audacity and success of the Pearl Harbor attack. The meeting that followed would reshape American foreign policy for decades to come. The president's famous phrase characterizing December 7th as a date which will live in infamy was crafted during the evening hours as Roosevelt and his speechwriters prepared for the congressional address that would formally bring America into World War II. Hopkins suggested various alternatives, but Roosevelt insisted on language that would capture the treacherous nature of the Japanese attack. Congressional leaders from both parties were summoned to emergency meetings as news of the attack spread throughout Washington. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, previously a leading isolationist, declared that the attack had ended America's ability to remain neutral in the global conflict. The bipartisan unity that would sustain America's war effort was forged in those first hours. After Pearl Harbor, J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately began rounding up suspected Japanese agents and sympathizers across the American mainland. Within hours, hundreds of Japanese Americans found themselves under arrest, the beginning of a civil liberties catastrophe that would shadow America's otherwise heroic war effort. The fear and anger generated by Pearl Harbor would lead to decisions that later generations would recognize as grave injustices. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, was hosting a luncheon for 30 guests when news of the attack arrived, demonstrating the grace under pressure that had made her a beloved First Lady. She calmly informed her guests of the situation and then immediately began planning her role. In the national response to the crisis, the War Department worked frantically to assess America's military readiness for a global conflict. The peacetime army of just over 1 million men would need to expand to fight on multiple continents. Industrial leaders were summoned to begin the massive conversion from civilian to military productivity, and that would transform America into what Roosevelt would later call the arsenal of democracy. As night fell on Washington, the president completed his preparations for the speech that would ask Congress for a declaration of war. The isolationist sentiment that had dominated American politics for 2 decades had been shattered in 2 hours of aerial combat over a Hawaiian harbor. America was about to embark on a global conflict that would establish it as a world superpower. But first, the nation had to overcome the greatest military disaster in its history. The morning of December 8, 1941, dawned gray and cold in Washington as members of Congress made their way to the Capitol building for one of the most momentous sessions in American history. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's motorcade moved slowly through streets lined with citizens who had gathered to witness their nation's formal entry into the Second World War. At 12:30 in the afternoon, Roosevelt entered the House chamber, his familiar figure supported by leg braces hidden beneath his formal attire. The packed gallery fell silent as the president approached the podium, carrying with him a speech that had been crafted during the long night following Pearl Harbor's destruction. Every word had been carefully chosen to rally a nation still reeling from the shock of surprise. Attack. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt's voice carried clearly through the chamber as he delivered what would become one of the most memorable speeches in American political history. The phrase infamy captured perfectly the sense of betrayal felt by a nation that had been negotiating for peace even as Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn and Vice President Henry Wallace flanked the president as he continued his brief but powerful address. Roosevelt had deliberately kept the speech short, less than 7 minutes. Knowing that the American people wanted action, not lengthy explanations. The time for diplomatic language had passed. This was a call to arms that would unite the nation behind a common cause. According to congressional records archived in the National Archives, Roosevelt's speech was interrupted by applause 34 times, demonstrating the unified support for war that Pearl Harbor had created among America's political leadership. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who had been one of the leading voices for American neutrality, listened to Roosevelt's words with the knowledge that isolationism had died at Pearl Harbor. The Michigan Republican had spent years arguing that America could remain aloof from European and Asian conflicts, but the burning ships in Hawaii had proved that geography alone could not protect the United States from global warfare. In the gallery, Eleanor Roosevelt watched her husband deliver the speech that would define his presidency's legacy. She understood better than most the enormous challenges that lay ahead, not just military victory, but maintaining democratic values while prosecuting a global war. The First Lady had already begun planning her own role in mobilizing American women for the war effort. The congressional vote that followed Roosevelt's speech was overwhelming, 419 to 1 in the House of Representatives, 82-0 in the Senate. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana cast the sole dissenting vote, maintaining her pacifist principles despite enormous political pressure. Her decision would effectively end her political career, but she remained convinced that war was never the solution to international disputes. General George Marshall and Admiral Harold Stark sat in the gallery, already planning the massive military expansion that would be required to fight simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific. The American military establishment, caught so completely off guard at Pearl Harbor, now faced the daunting task of building the largest military force in the nation's history. While learning to fight a technologically advanced enemy, news of America's declaration of war spread rapidly round the globe. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill felt a sense of relief that Britain would no longer stand alone against the Axis powers. The alliance between Britain and America, forged in the fires of Pearl Harbor, would prove to be the cornerstone of Allied victory in World War II. Japanese leaders in Tokyo received news of Roosevelt's speech with mixed emotions. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned his government that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. The tactical success of December 7th was already being overshadowed by the strategic implications of bringing America's industrial might into the war. As evening fell on December 8th, Americans across the nation gathered around their radios to hear the news from Washington. The vote for war had been virtually unanimous, reflecting a national unity that had not existed since the earliest days of the Republic. Pearl Harbor had accomplished what years of diplomatic argument could not. It had united America behind a single cause. The transformation from isolationist democracy to global superpower had begun with Roosevelt's 6-minute speech. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto feared had indeed awakened, and the world would never be the same. America was now committed to a global conflict that would test every aspect of its national character and ultimately establish it as the leader of the free world. The weeks following Pearl Harbor witnessed a transformation of American society unlike anything in the nation's history. The attack that was intended to cripple America's ability to interfere with Japanese expansion in the Pacific had instead unleashed industrial and military capabilities that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis powers. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken was stirring with a vengeance that would reshape the global balance of power. Within days of Roosevelt's declaration of war, American factories began the massive conversion from civilian to military production. Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, previously manufacturing automobiles, started producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The industrial might that had lifted America out of the Great Depression was now being directed toward military purposes with single-minded determination. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, to assume command of the Pacific Fleet. Walking among the still-burning wreckage of Battleship Row, The new commander assessed both the damage and the opportunities that lay ahead. While the battleships had been devastated, the aircraft carriers had been at sea during the attack, a stroke of fortune that would prove crucial in the carrier-based warfare that would dominate the Pacific conflict. The salvage operations at Pearl Harbor became a symbol of American determination to overcome the disaster. Captain Homer Wallen's teams worked around the clock to raise the sunken vessels, with the USS Oklahoma requiring one of the most complex salvage operations in naval history. The sight of American ships being literally raised from the dead served as a powerful metaphor for the nation's recovery from its greatest military defeat. Historical records from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard document that 6 of the 8 battleships damaged in the attack were eventually returned to service, with several participating in the final victory over Japan in 1940-5. The human dimension of Pearl Harbor's aftermath was equally remarkable. Doris Miller, the African-American cook who had manned an anti-aircraft gun during the attack, became one of the first heroes celebrated in American war propaganda. His actions helped begin the slow process of racial integration in the military, though full equality would not come until after the war's end. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was already planning the retaliatory raid that would bear his name, a daring bombing attack on Japan itself that would restore American morale and demonstrate that the Japanese home islands were not invulnerable. The Doolittle raid of April 18, 1942, traced its origins directly to the desire for revenge generated by Pearl Harbor. The attack also accelerated scientific and technological developments that would change warfare forever. The Manhattan Project, America's secret atomic weapons program, received increased funding and priority in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Scientists like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi found their theoretical research suddenly given practical urgency by the demands of global warfare. American women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in defense plants that had previously been reserved for men. Rosie the Riveter became an icon of American determination, representing millions of women who kept the factories running while their husbands, brothers, and sons fought overseas. The social changes initiated by Pearl Harbor would permanently transform American society. The intelligence failures that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible led to a complete reorganization of American intelligence gathering. The Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, was established to ensure that America would never again be caught so completely off guard by enemy action. By December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after the attack, America had become the world's dominant military power. The Pacific Fleet had been rebuilt and expanded. American forces were fighting on multiple continents, and the industrial production that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis was reaching its peak efficiency. The memorial services held on the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor took place on a transformed world stage. America had evolved from an isolationist democracy to the leader of a global alliance, fighting for democratic values. The men who died at Pearl Harbor had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had awakened a nation to its global responsibilities and capabilities. The surprise attack that was supposed to eliminate America as a factor in Pacific affairs had instead created a superpower. Pearl Harbor had indeed been a date that lived in infamy, but it had also become the foundation stone of American global leadership. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, and the world would never be the same.